Before we dive into tonight's story, I need to know, are you ready for this? Drop a comment and tell me how old you are, what city you're watching from, and whether you've ever heard a story that changed how you see the world. And if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button because tonight's story isn't just history, it's about what happens when silence becomes deadly. October 15th, 1852. Wickham Plantation, Hanover County, Virginia. The harvest festival was supposed to be a celebration. It became a graveyard. Sarah. That was the name of the woman who, on a night when the autumn air tasted like wood smoke and dying leaves, served poisoned wine to 7 white men and watched them die with the same expression she wore while scrubbing their floors. No tears, no trembling hands. Just the quiet efficiency of someone who had been planning this moment for longer than anyone could imagine. The great house sits on a rise overlooking the James River, its white columns gleaming in the lamplight like tombstones. Tonight, those columns cast shadows across the wide porch, where tables groan under the weight of roasted pig, cornbread, and mason jars filled with amber liquid that catches the flickering light. The smell of celebration hangs heavy in the air, sweet tobacco smoke, rendered fat, and underneath it all, the sharp bite of fermented fruit that will soon become something else entirely. Sarah moves between the tables like a ghost in brown homespun, her bare feet silent on the wooden planks. She is 28 years old, though her hands look older, scarred from years of lye soap and scalding water. Her skin is the color of rich earth after rain, and her eyes hold secrets that would terrify anyone who bothered to look closely enough. But they never look closely. They never see her at all. She was trained to be invisible, taught to move through their world without disturbing the air around her, to anticipate their needs before they spoke them, to absorb their cruelty like a sponge soaks up spilled wine. What they didn't know was that Sarah had been absorbing something else for the past 3 years. Knowledge, names, habits. The exact way each man took his drink, the precise moment when their guard dropped, the secret ingredients that could turn celebration into judgment. Tonight, 7 men will discover what happens when the invisible become inevitable. Master Thomas Wickham sits at the head of the longest table, his face red from drink and self-satisfaction. Beside him, his brother Henry drums his fingers against his glass, already reaching for another pour. Overseer Jacob Mills laughs too loudly at something that isn't funny, while plantation manager Samuel Burke counts the evening's profits in his head. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, visiting from Richmond, speaks of new methods for managing difficult slaves. Attorney Jonathan Caldwell boasts about a recent court case, and merchant William Foster discusses crop prices with the casual authority of a man who has never planted a single seed with his own hands. 7 names. Sarah knows them all. She knows how Thomas Wickham likes his bourbon neat, how Henry prefers his with just a splash of branch water. She knows that Jacob Mills will drink anything strong enough to burn, that Samuel Burke favors imported wine when he can get it, and that Dr. Hartwell insists on brandy because it's medicinal. She knows Jonathan Caldwell's weakness for aged whiskey and William Foster's preference for whatever costs the most. She knows all of this because knowing is how the invisible survive. But tonight, knowing becomes something deadlier. Before we continue with the video, drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time it is over there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The first time Sarah saw death, she was 7 years old. It came for her mother on a Tuesday morning in March, when the daffodils were just beginning to push through the cold ground and the air still held winter's bite. Consumption, they called it, but Sarah knew better. Her mother died from breathing too much sorrow, from swallowing too many screams, from carrying the weight of every small cruelty until her body simply couldn't hold anymore. "Remember my name," her mother whispered with her last breath. Her fingers wrapped around Sarah's small hand. "Remember all our names?" Sarah remembered. She remembered Mary, who bore 5 children and buried 3. She remembered how Mary hummed while she worked, how she saved scraps of fabric to make Sarah a doll, how she taught her daughter to read using a Bible stolen from the big house. She remembered the sound Mary made when Thomas Wickham's hand connected with her face after she spilled tea on his newspaper. a sound like something breaking that could never be fixed. After Mary died, Sarah was moved to the kitchen. "She's old enough to earn her keep," Henry Wickham declared, as if Sarah hadn't been working since she could walk. The kitchen was ruled by old Martha, a woman whose back was bent from decades of standing over hot stoves and whose hands were mapping of burn scars and knife cuts. Martha took one look at 7-year-old Sarah and saw something that made her step back. "This one's different," Martha told the other kitchen slaves that first night. "This one's got fire behind her eyes." Martha was wrong. Sarah didn't have fire. She had ice, the kind that forms slowly, quietly, building layer by layer until it becomes something that can crack stone. In the kitchen, Sarah learned more than cooking. She learned about plants that grew wild in the woods behind the slave quarters, plants that Martha's grandmother had known about in the old country. Plants that could heal, plants that could harm, plants that could send a person to sleep so deep they never woke up. Martha taught her these things not as lessons but as stories. Tales passed down from women who understood that knowledge was the only thing that couldn't be bought or sold. "Every plant's got two faces," Martha would say, grinding herbs in her wooden mortar. "One face helps, one face hurts. Same plant, different measure." Sarah absorbed these lessons like scripture. She learned that pokeweed berries could ease rheumatism or stop a heart, depending on how many you used. She discovered that Jimson weed could treat asthma or cause madness, that water hemlock could cure headaches or paralyze muscles, that castor beans could purge the bowels or shut down every organ in the body. "Why are you teaching me this?" Sarah asked one summer evening when she was 12, watching Martha prepare a tincture for Master Thomas's gout. Martha's hands never stopped moving, but her voice dropped to a whisper. "Because knowledge is power, child, and power is the only thing they can't take from you unless you let them." That same summer, Sarah met Daniel. He was 15, sold down from Maryland after his previous master died, and he had the most beautiful hands Sarah had ever seen. Carpenter's hands, skilled and gentle, capable of creating furniture so fine that Thomas Wickham sold pieces to wealthy families in Richmond. Daniel carved animals from scraps of wood, tiny birds and rabbits that seemed ready to spring to life. He gave them to the children in the quarters, and one day he gave one to Sarah. It was a fox, no bigger than her thumb, with eyes that seemed almost human. "Foxes are smart," Daniel told her. "They know how to wait, how to watch, how to survive when everything's against them." Sarah kept that fox hidden in her dress pocket, and at night she would run her fingers over its smooth surface and think about patience, about watching, about surviving. For 3 years, Sarah and Daniel found ways to be together, stolen moments between tasks, whispered conversations during Sunday meetings, hands touching when they passed each other carrying water buckets or armloads of firewood. Daniel talked about freedom the way other people talked about weather, as something real, something possible, something worth planning for. "We could go north," he would say, tracing patterns on Sarah's palm with his fingertip. "I heard tell of places where folks like us can live free, where a man can build his own house and no one can take it from him." Sarah wanted to believe. She let herself imagine a life where she woke up beside Daniel every morning, where she cooked food that she would eat, where children called her mama and meant it as love instead of ownership. She let herself hope, and hope was dangerous on a plantation where dreams were luxuries that slaves couldn't afford. The breaking came on a September morning when the air smelled like ripening tobacco and the light fell golden across the fields. Sarah was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard the commotion in the yard, shouting voices, running feet, the kind of chaos that meant someone was about to pay for something. She ran to the window and saw Daniel on his knees in the dirt, his hands bound behind his back, blood streaming from his nose. "Caught him with this," Jacob Mills announced, holding up a piece of paper covered with Daniel's careful handwriting. Sarah couldn't read the words from the window, but she didn't need to. She knew what they said. Daniel had been writing passes, forged documents that could help slaves travel without being questioned. He had been planning escapes, mapping routes to freedom, and now he was going to die for it. They made everyone watch. Every slave on the plantation was forced to stand in the yard while Thomas Wickham read Daniel's crimes aloud. While Jacob Mills prepared the rope, while Henry Wickham explained the lesson they were all supposed to learn, Sarah stood with the others, her face blank as stone, her hands steady at her sides, while inside her chest, something crystallized into something harder than diamond. She didn't cry. She just watched Daniel's body turn slowly in the autumn wind and committed every detail to memory. The way his carpenter's hands hung limp and still, the sound the rope made against the oak tree's branches, the satisfied expressions on the faces of the 7 men who had signed his death warrant with their silence. That night, Sarah took the wooden fox from her pocket and held it until the edges bit into her palm. She thought about Daniel's words about survival, about patience, about knowing when to wait and when to strike. She thought about her mother's dying words, about remembering names, about Martha's lessons about plants with 2 faces, about the poison that lived inside healing. She began to plan. The planning took 3 years. 3 years of perfect behavior, of invisible service, of watching and learning and preparing for a moment that might never come. Sarah studied the 7 men who ruled her world like a naturalist studies specimens. She learned their schedules, their preferences, their weaknesses, their fears. She discovered that Thomas Wickham suffered from terrible headaches that left him desperate for relief. That Henry drank to forget what he had done during the war. That Jacob Mills couldn't sleep without laudanum. That Samuel Burke had a weak stomach that required careful management. She learned that Dr. Hartwell was addicted to the medicines he prescribed for others. That Attorney Caldwell gambled away more money than he made. And that Merchant Foster had debts that would ruin him if they became public knowledge. She learned all of this by being invisible, by cleaning their rooms and washing their clothes and serving their meals while they talked around her as if she were a piece of furniture. But most importantly, she learned about their celebrations. How they marked successful harvests with elaborate feasts, how they brought out their finest liquors for special occasions, how they drank themselves senseless while congratulating each other on their prosperity. She learned that vanity made them careless, that greed made them stupid, and that alcohol made them vulnerable. During those 3 years, Sarah also continued her education with Martha. She collected plants during her rare free hours, drying them in hidden spaces and grinding them into powders that she stored in tiny cloth bags sewn into the lining of her dress. She practiced mixing compounds, testing combinations on rats in the barn, and documenting which doses caused which effects. She became an expert in death delivered drop by drop, grain by grain, in measures so small that they seemed like accidents. Water hemlock became her specialty, the plant that looked so much like harmless wild carrot that even experienced foragers made fatal mistakes. Sarah learned to extract its essence, to concentrate its poison, to mask its bitter taste with honey and spices. She learned that a single gram could kill a grown man in minutes, causing convulsions so violent that observers would assume he was suffering from some natural ailment. She also studied castor beans, beautiful red and black seeds that contained ricin, a poison so potent that just a few ground seeds could cause organ failure that looked like natural illness. Unlike hemlock, ricin worked slowly, taking days to kill, allowing time for the victim to suffer while appearing to die from some mysterious fever or stomach ailment. The third poison in Sarah's arsenal came from pokerweed, a plant that grew wild throughout Virginia and was actually used in small doses as medicine. Sarah learned to extract and concentrate the toxic saponins from the plant's roots, creating a substance that could cause respiratory failure while mimicking the symptoms of consumption, the same disease that had killed her mother. For months, Sarah carried these poisons with her, waiting for the right moment, the perfect opportunity. She needed all 7 men in one place, relaxed and off guard, drinking enough to mask any unusual tastes, but not so much that they couldn't properly experience their deaths. She needed them isolated from help, surrounded by slaves who would be too terrified to intervene, and she needed enough chaos to cover her escape afterward. The Bee. Harvest Festival of 1852 provided everything she had been waiting for. October had been perfect for tobacco harvesting, warm days and cool nights that concentrated the sugars in the leaves and created the Conditions for a profitable crop. Thomas Wickham was ecstatic about the prices he was getting from Richmond buyers, and he decided to celebrate with the most elaborate festival the plantation had ever seen. He invited his brother Henry down from Fredericksburg, along with the 5 other men who formed his inner circle of advisors and business partners. The festival was scheduled for October 15th, a Saturday evening when the work was done and the moon would be dark. Perfect for celebration, perfect for secrets, perfect for revenge. On the morning of October 15th, Sarah woke before dawn and began her preparations. She moved through the kitchen like a dancer, her hands sure and steady as she prepared the feast that would become a funeral. Roasted pig seasoned with herbs that would disguise other tastes, cornbread sweet with molasses that would mask bitter flavors, pickled vegetables that would encourage drinking, and most importantly, she prepared the special drinks that each man would receive. For Thomas Wickham, she laced his favorite bourbon with concentrated hemlock extract, enough to kill him quickly, but not so much that he would taste it over the whiskey's burn. For Henry, she chose pokeweed poison mixed into his branch water, a slow death that would mimic the consumption that had claimed so many slaves. Jacob Mills received castor beans ground fine and stirred into his rotgut whiskey, a painful end that would take days to complete. Samuel Burke's imported wine carried a double dose of hemlock, while Dr. Hartwell's medicinal brandy contained enough ricin to shut down his kidneys within hours. Attorney Caldwell's aged whiskey was enhanced with pokeweed root extract, and Merchant Foster's expensive vintage received a mixture of all 3 poisons, ensuring that the man who profited most from slave labor would suffer the most comprehensive death. Sarah prepared each drink with the precision of a pharmacist and the devotion of a priest performing communion. This wasn't murder. This was justice served one drop at a time, payment collected for debts that had been accumulating for decades. As the sun set and the men gathered on the porch, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since Daniel's death. Peace. Not happiness, not satisfaction, but the deep calm that comes from knowing that everything is about to be exactly as it should be. The harvest festival began at sunset with toasts to prosperity, to tradition, to the natural order of things that kept some people free and others enslaved. The 7 men raised their glasses high, completely unaware that they were drinking their own deaths, that the invisible woman moving between their tables had just delivered the most complete justice that plantation had ever seen. Sarah served the poison with the same careful attention she had always shown. She made sure each man received exactly the right glass, that no one else touched the contaminated drinks, that every dose was perfectly calibrated for maximum effect. She moved like a shadow, anticipated needs before they were spoken, and watched with satisfaction as each man praised the quality of his particular beverage. Thomas Wickham was the first to show symptoms. 20 minutes after his second glass of bourbon, he began sweating heavily despite the cool evening air. His hands shook as he reached for more food, and his words started slurring slightly. The other men teased him about not holding his liquor, not realizing they were witnessing the first stages of hemlock poisoning. "Just need some air," Thomas mumbled, pushing back from the table. He made it 3 steps before his legs gave out. The convulsions started as he hit the ground, his body jerking violently as the poison attacked his nervous system. Foam appeared at the corners of his mouth, and his breathing became rapid and shallow. Dr. Hartwell immediately knelt beside his host, checking his pulse and examining his symptoms with professional concern. "Looks like some kind of seizure," he announced, probably brought on by excitement and too much rich food. The irony was perfect, the doctor diagnosing another man's poisoning while his own kidneys were already beginning to fail. Henry Wickham was the second to fall. The pokeweed poison worked more slowly than hemlock, but it was no less thorough. He began coughing, a dry hack that gradually produced blood-flecked sputum. His breathing became labored, and his face took on the grayish pallor that Sarah remembered from her mother's final days. "Must be catching something," Henry gasped, leaning heavily on the table. "Feel like I can't get enough air." He collapsed into his chair, his chest rising and falling with increasing difficulty as the plant toxins systematically destroyed his respiratory system. Jacob Mills lasted longer, his constitution strengthened by years of violence and cruelty. But the castor beans were patient, working their way through his digestive system and into his bloodstream with methodical efficiency. He began vomiting around 9 o'clock. Violent retching that brought up everything he had consumed mixed with increasing amounts of blood. Something's wrong with the food. He managed between bouts of sickness. We've been poisoned. But even as he spoke the words, Jacob couldn't quite believe them. Who would poison them? Who would dare? He looked around the porch with growing panic, his eyes passing over Sarah without truly seeing her. Still unable to imagine that the woman who had served him faithfully for 21 years could be capable of such complete betrayal. Dr. Hartwell might have been able to help if he hadn't been dying himself. The ricin was working its way through his kidneys, shutting down his body's ability to filter toxins from his blood. He felt increasingly nauseated and weak, but attributed his symptoms to stress and overindulgence. By the time he realized he was experiencing kidney failure, he was too weak to treat anyone, including himself. Samuel Burke died quietly, the double dose of hemlock overwhelming his system too quickly for dramatic symptoms. One moment he was reaching for his wine glass, the next he was face down on the table, his body completely still. His death was almost peaceful, a small mercy that Sarah hadn't intended but didn't regret. Attorney Caldwell and Merchant Foster lasted until nearly midnight, the pokeweed and mixed poisons working more slowly but no less certainly. They spent their final hours in increasing agony, their bodies racked with pain as multiple toxins competed to shut down different organ systems. Foster, in particular, suffered exactly as Sarah had hoped, experiencing every type of death she had prepared while remaining conscious enough to understand what was happening to him. As the evening progressed and more men collapsed, the remaining slaves on the plantation gathered in the shadows around the big house. They watched in amazement and terror as their oppressors died one by one, their faces reflecting a mixture of fear and something that might have been hope. Some whispered prayers, others stood in stunned silence, but all understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that would be remembered and retold for generations. Sarah continued serving throughout the entire event, moving calmly between the dying men, offering water that wouldn't help, and comfort that she didn't mean. She checked pulses with hands that didn't tremble, cleaned up vomit with the same efficiency she had always shown, and watched 7 lives end with the detached interest of someone observing a particularly satisfying scientific experiment. When Dr. Hartwell finally collapsed, his professional composure cracking as he realized what was happening to his own body, he looked up at Sarah with dawning understanding. "You," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You did this." Sarah knelt beside him, her face inches from his ear. "I did this for Mary," she said quietly, "for Daniel, for every person whose name you never bothered to learn." She watched the light fade from his eyes with the same expression she wore while kneading bread, completely unmoved by his suffering. By dawn, all 7 men were dead. The harvest festival had become exactly what Sarah intended, a reckoning, a settling of accounts that had been overdue for decades. She had served justice with the same hands that had served their meals, had delivered death with the same precision she had always used to anticipate their needs. The plantation erupted in chaos as word spread to the surrounding farms and towns. Authorities arrived by noon, along with doctors who performed cursory examinations and declared the deaths to be the result of some mysterious illness or contaminated food. No one seriously considered that a slave might be responsible, that someone they considered property could possess the knowledge and determination necessary for such a comprehensive act of revenge. Sarah was questioned, of course, along with every other slave on the plantation, but she answered with the same quiet deference she had always shown, expressing appropriate shock and sadness at the tragedy that had befallen her masters. The investigators saw exactly what they expected to see: a simple kitchen slave, uneducated and incapable of the sophisticated planning that such murders would require. They were looking for a monster, and Sarah appeared to be exactly what she had always been: invisible. The official investigation concluded that the 7 men had died from some combination of bad food and excessive drinking, possibly complicated by a contagious illness that Dr. Hartwell had inadvertently brought from Richmond. It was a convenient explanation that allowed everyone to avoid uncomfortable questions about how secure their own control really was, how vulnerable they might be to people they had trained themselves not to see. Sarah was sold to a plantation in South Carolina within a month, along with most of the other Wickham slaves. The new owners had no interest in keeping people who had witnessed such an unsettling event, and scattering the survivors served to prevent any organized retelling of what had actually happened. But stories have a way of surviving even when storytellers are silenced. The tale of the Harvest Festival spread through the slave quarters of Virginia and beyond, carried by field hands and house servants, by carpenters and seamstresses, by all the invisible people who moved between plantations and saw things that their owners preferred to ignore. They called her Sarah the Fox, remembering the wooden animal that Daniel had carved for her and the patience she had shown in planning her revenge. They said she had learned the secret language of plants, that she could brew death from ingredients that grew wild in any forest, that she had proven that even the most powerless person could become dangerous if they were willing to wait long enough. The story grew with each telling, acquiring details that may or may not have been true but served to make the message clearer. Some versions claimed that Sarah had poisoned dozens of white men, that she had started a revolution that would spread across the South, that she had been sent by God to deliver justice to the oppressed. Others insisted that she was still alive somewhere, still mixing her deadly compounds, still waiting for the right moment to strike again. What actually happened to Sarah after she left Virginia remains unknown. Some say she escaped to the north and lived to see emancipation. Others believe she died in South Carolina, worn down by years of hard labor and the emotional toll of carrying so much death in her memories. A few claim that she was eventually caught and executed for her crimes, though no official records support this version of events. The truth doesn't matter as much as the story itself, the message that traveled from plantation to plantation and gave hope to people who had every reason to despair. Sarah had proved that resistance was possible, that the invisible could become inevitable, that justice delayed was not necessarily justice denied. Her story became a teaching tool, passed down from parents to children as both warning and promise. It taught patience, planning, and the power of knowledge. It demonstrated that even in the most oppressive circumstances, even when facing opponents with every advantage, it was possible to find ways to fight back. More importantly, it preserved the names that Sarah had died to honor. Mary, who had taught her daughter to remember. Daniel, who had carved hope from scraps of wood. Martha, who had passed down the old knowledge that could heal or harm. All the forgotten people whose lives had mattered, whose deaths had demanded payment, whose memories had fueled the most perfect revenge in Virginia's history. The poison that Sarah had brewed that October night wasn't just extracted from plants. It was distilled from years of accumulated pain, refined from the pure essence of injustice, concentrated from the knowledge that some debts can only be paid in blood. She had served it with the same hands that had served countless meals, had delivered it with the same efficiency that had characterized her entire life of service. But for one perfect evening, Sarah had not been serving her masters. She had been serving something larger: justice, memory, the accumulated weight of every slight and every cruelty that had ever been inflicted on people who were considered less than human. She had been the instrument of a reckoning that was long overdue, the answer to prayers that had been whispered in slave quarters across the South. If this story haunts you, it's because it represents something that every oppressor fears and every oppressed person dreams about. The moment when the powerless discover their power, when the invisible step into the light, when patience transforms into action and servitude becomes revolution. Subscribe and share with those who understand that some stories are too important to forget, that some names deserve to be remembered, and that sometimes the most devastating resistance comes not from armies or rebellion, but from a single person who decides that enough is finally enough.